is Naomi Church, and I'm a program specialist with the Florida Diagnostic and Learning Resources System. Today, we're going to talk about mathematics strategy-based instruction within a multi-tiered system of supports. So first, let's think about why should we revisit MTSS in math? Well, if we look at the research, it shows us that in the absence of instruction and intervention, students with mathematics difficulties and disabilities lag significantly behind their peers. Additionally, early mathematics intervention can repair deficits and even prevent future deficits. So we know that this is super important, but then the question becomes, how do we do it? Well, one of the most common questions that I receive is, what is the difference between reteaching and remediation? So let's start with that. Think about reteaching as being connected with the standards. So you reteach the standards. This is part of high quality tier 1 instruction. You can identify the standard deficit by using a chapter test or even a formative assessment. So the student doesn't do well on the chapter test or the formative assessment, and then the teacher reteaches it a different way, maybe using a different manipulative, maybe by pulling the student into small group, or maybe even by using a different video lesson in e-learning. This is all part of high quality tier 1 instruction. This is different than remediation. So remediation has to do with a skill deficit. So this comes into play at tier 2 and or tier 3. And you can identify a skill deficit by using a screener or even a diagnostic assessment. So here there are some foundational skills that appear to be missing or deficient, and those get corrected in order to help the child be successful with mathematics throughout. So here we would use an intervention program or a research or evidence-based strategy to remediate the student. So where does this fit in? Well, reteaching fits in at tier 1, and so this is part of core instruction and supports. Then tier 2 is targeted supplemental instruction and intervention, and remediation can fit here, as well as at tier 3, which is intensive individualized instruction and intervention. So intervention is not necessarily synonymous with a program. A lot of times we hear the words intervention program together. So when a student is being remediated, the way that we do that is with an intervention. But an intervention doesn't have to be a program. It could also be a strategy. So some popular intervention programs that you may already be familiar with in math are here. So programs come from a publisher. And so you may even have some of these at your school site. Touch Math, Number Sense Interventions, Moving with Math, and Number Worlds. Instructional strategies, however, are methods teachers use to create independent and strategic learners. Our goal is to build the capacity of learners in selecting the appropriate strategies to meet grade level expectations. So why would we use strategies instead of programs? Well, for one, they're free. When it comes to intervention programs, typically a purchase has to be made. You need the physical program at your site in order to implement. So research and evidence-based strategies are free. This is really great too if a student is transient and moves from school to school. The program typically belongs to the school, but a strategy can be utilized by anybody. So strategies also offer more flexible implementation, whereas programs usually have strict guidelines as to the duration and frequency of the implementation, strategies don't necessarily have that. And so they can be more easily adapted for online learning. So while you may not have the physical pieces of an intervention program in your students' homes and even in your home while remote learning, you're still able to use research and evidence-based strategies online. So the IES guide from the What Works Clearinghouse on assessing students struggling with mathematics response to intervention for elementary and middle schools came out with this publication, and it has all kinds of information about intervention and response to intervention. You can find this for free right on the IES website. And so what they said is that Tier 2 students receive supplemental small group mathematics instruction aimed at building a targeted mathematics proficiencies. These interventions are typically provided for 20 to 40 minutes, 4 to 5 times each week. Student progress is monitored throughout the intervention. So that's their recommendation as far as Tier 2 goes. So there's a wide range there, anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes from 4 to 5 times a week. Now, of course, that's not a mandate. You can be flexible with that, but that's their recommendation. So now, what makes a strategy an intervention? Because strategies can be used at all tiers of instruction. So what specifically makes it an intervention? Well, increased frequency. So I'm doing it more often. So instead of 2 days a week, I'm doing it 4 days a week. Increased duration. So perhaps instead of 20 minutes a session, I'm doing 30 minutes a session. Reduced group size. Instead of this being something that we do whole group, it's something that I do in small group. It's formalized. So it's not just something I do whenever. There's like a set schedule to this. It's aimed at a known need. I'm specifically using this strategy to remediate a known deficit area. And of course, it's progress monitored. And as far as progress monitoring, we're really looking at once a week as the guideline for this. So some of this requires a paradigm shift in MTSS. So we think of intervention as for a few students, and instead we should be thinking about prevention and instruction for all students. So if we think about this multi-tiered system of supports as the way to reach and teach all learners, then really we see where reteach fits in. And the more that we amp up our tier 1 instruction, the less we have a need for intervention. So identifying which students need help. Instead of that, maybe thinking, identifying what help each student needs. So everybody is going to have things that they're good at and things that they're not so good at, and we can focus in on building up all of the students. Using programs and people available, and instead thinking about intentional design and redesign of services and supports matched to the needs of the student. So just because you have a certain program in your building doesn't mean that that program works best for the students you have, and it doesn't mean that you should even necessarily be using that program. So we need to remember, though, that students are not tiers. So every student, of course, is an individual. And what we know is that some students may have strengths in some areas and may have more challenges in other areas. So it's important to note that disability alone does not determine the intensity of instruction. MTSS is designed to be a fluid process with movement into and out of specific levels of tiered instruction over time. Children with disabilities may begin to receive more intensive services at tier 2 or 3, and movement between the tiers will be based on their response to the intervention within that tier. You can learn more from this great article called Instructional Intervention, What You Need to Know. So you can look it up online. You can also just scan the QR code here to bring you directly to that article. So let's talk about priority educational needs. So now that we understand why MTSS is so important and even sort of where it fits into the scope of things, we need help determining the priority educational needs of our students within mathematics. So these researchers in 2003 found that there are 3 general levels of math skill development, and that as students move from lower to higher grades, they move through levels of acquisition of math skills to include number sense, basic math operations, also known as arithmetic or computation, and then problem solving skills. So to put it more visual, here's a flow map for you, mapping out the priority educational need in mathematics. So what we know is that students who are struggling in math, typically all of them are struggling in problem solving. But remediating in the area of problem solving often doesn't fix the deficit area. We need to find out what the priority is. So if they have a deficit in number sense, then that's going to be our priority educational need that we identify in the PLP within the IEP. And that's where we start. If we're talking about RTI, same thing, this is where we're going to start. So think of number sense is to math what phonics is to reading. So that is to say it's the foundation that everything is built on, right? So in reading, if we know that a student is having trouble with phonics, we don't do a reading comprehension intervention. That wouldn't make sense. Of course, they're struggling with reading comprehension if they can't read the words on the page. Well, it's a similar kind of progression within mathematics. We're not going to do interventions in problem solving if number sense, the foundation, is really where the problem lies. So let's learn a little bit more about what number sense is. So, the characteristics of good number sense include fluency in estimating and judging magnitude. So this is basically being able to look at 2 piles and determine which one has more, which one is bigger. Being able to recognize which is more just from looking. So about 91% of kids from affluent families can do this when they enter kindergarten. However, only about 17% of our lower SES students can do this when they arrive in kindergarten. So as children develop a more sophisticated understanding of number and quantity, they're able to make increasingly complex judgments about magnitude. So this is not something that we can assume our kids have coming in, because it varies greatly depending on the socioeconomic background of the students we're talking about. So also included in the characteristics of good number sense are the ability to recognize unreasonable results. And so if you think about this with kids, maybe bringing a problem like Mary bought 12 donuts. Naomi ate 5 of them. How many donuts are left? If a student answers 200 donuts, then we know that that's not reasonable. They're lacking basic number sense. So even if they can't do the computation, they know and understand what is reasonable and not. So then flexibility when mentally computing. So this is knowing that a 10 is made up of a 5 and a 5, or an 8 and a 2, or a 3 and a 7. So they can think flexibly when it comes to numbers, and basically they understand that numbers are made up of other numbers. And finally, the ability to move among different representations and to use the most appropriate representation. So if we know that numbers are flexible things and we can see numbers in different ways, some representations are going to be more appropriate and more efficient than others. So both Birch and Griffin also note that people with good number sense seem to develop a mental number line on which they can represent and manipulate numerical quantities. So basically, people with good number sense have this visual number line and they can sort of move the numbers around in their head and they know where the numbers are in relation to each other. So what are some strategies that we can use to increase number sense? Well, one routine that we can use is number sense. And then another strategy that we can use is games. And yes, playing games is actually a strategy. So if we're working specifically on number sense, we can play games like dominoes, trouble, even some card games, and the Great Number Line Race is a specific game that was developed to work on number sense. So you can find more of these number sense games and activities in Joe Bowler's article, Fluency Without Fear, and you can also find more on Intervention Central. For elementary ages, a book that I recommend for working on number talks is this one, Number Sense Routines. But then this is something that we can also do at the secondary level. So if you teach secondary, then this book would be more appropriate for you, Making Number Talks Matter. And this is for grades 3 through 10. And it really takes a look at the same strategy, but with some of our older learners. Because just because a student is in intermediate or secondary doesn't mean that they have mastered number sense. So this is a little video from the authors of that book for secondary.
Number talks are a safe space bounded by about 15 minutes a day where students of all ages have opportunities to not only learn about number, but learn, more importantly maybe, that they have mathematical ideas worth listening to, and that mathematics makes sense, and that they can make sense of it in their own ways. And the conversations that happen around those diverse ways of seeing that kids solve problems, I think, deepen understandings for all of the students in the classroom, and they deepen the mathematical understandings of the teachers as well. It turns on its head the way we've always thought about teaching arithmetic, but in its place, instead of children with a very fragile understanding of number, we end up with students who really understand numbers and computations and the relationships involved and why they work.
I first realized how important number talks could be for them, and so wanted to use them with older students. But then I realized that as they were starting to make sense for themselves, they also were using mathematical practices, almost every single mathematical practice in the process of doing a number talk, and they were developing one of the most important aspects of being powerful mathematically by starting to take on the agency for their own learning. The baggage that kids bring when they're older of not being good at math, not feeling good about themselves, vanishes when all they have to do is figure out what they see. And then through that, looking at the different ways people see, they realize that people have different ways of thinking about math, and they learn to explain their reasoning in a very safe setting.
I've also had opportunities to use dot cards with high school students who had histories of failure in mathematics, and the power that happens in terms of students being willing to carry the discourse in a classroom is, I I think, thrilling, and I haven't found any other instructional strategy that gets them there. And I do think at the essence of that is it's a topic where they don't have to bring all their math injuries and math fears. It's just, what do you see? One girl described it for us as, she said, I used to feel like I was the dumb kid in math. Everybody was getting things that I wasn't getting. And I learned through this that I really can see things in math my own way, and that's okay. And in seeing things my own way, I realized I can do math, and sometimes I even get things before other people around me. So the payoff is just comes in so many different ways to students and I think to teachers. It brings the joy back into teaching. Number talks are
Okay, so after number sense, the next thing in our flow chart was computation. So computation has a lot to it. When we're talking about computational fluency, we're really thinking about these components of procedural fluency. So that is accuracy, efficiency, appropriate strategy use, and flexibility. So accuracy deals with the ability to produce mathematically precise answers, right? And of course, that's the goal. But then also we're talking about efficiency. So the ability to select and apply a strategy that is appropriate for solving the given problem efficiently. So for example, if I'm talking about 42 times 3, drawing 42 groups of 3 is not an efficient strategy. It will get you to the correct answer, but it's not very efficient. Appropriate strategy use is the ability to select and apply a strategy that's appropriate for solving the given problem efficiency. So that ties in with efficiency, right? And then flexibility, the ability to think about a problem in more than one way and to adapt or adjust thinking if necessary. And this is usually the piece that's forgotten about, and yet it's the most important. So why does computation make it onto our flow chart of priority educational need? Well, basically it shows up in IDEA's definition of a specific learning disability. So it is possible for a student to have a specific learning disability identified in the area of mathematics, even if it's not identified in other areas, just based on their ability to do mathematical calculations. How can we find out if computation is a deficit area? Well, we can use a curriculum-based measure as a screener. These measures have been found to yield reliable scores over time that correlate moderately with other more comprehensive measures of mathematics performance. Research indicates that the use of computation-only assessment and intervention has demonstrated value for early identification of children who are likely to struggle with advanced problem solving in mathematics. Because these probes can be administered to an entire class at one time and require only 2 minutes of the student's time, they're currently the measures of choice for many different districts and schools for screening in mathematics. So curriculum-based measures, also referred to as CBMs, are basically just probes, and we can use these for either screening or even for progress monitoring. So this website on the bottom here, you can use to get to the CBM computation probes. So when it comes to intervention, so once we've identified the deficit, then what do we do about it? Well, you can find some intervention ideas on Intervention Central, and this is a screenshot of some of the possibilities, and these are all strategies that can be used, and so some of them are going to lend themselves better than others to the e-learning situation. Another strategy to address computation are math games. So games and other enjoyable challenges provide ample fact practice without constantly drilling. So additionally, games can be interactive so students can think aloud and hear other strategies. Think aloud opportunities are beneficial to all students, but are particularly effective with students who traditionally struggle to learn mathematics. So you can find some great games to use specifically to work on fluency in Jenny Bay Williams and Gina Kling's book, Math Fact Fluency. This is just a picture of me with Jenny Bay Williams. So this book has all of the research, the most recent research behind fluency in the beginning of the book, and then you'll find more than 60 games and assessment tools specifically related to that. So let's go back to this. What makes a strategy an intervention? So if we're talking about games, if we're talking about instructional routines, what makes those strategies an intervention? Well, again, it comes back to increased frequency, increased duration, reduced group size. Is it formalized? Is it aimed at a known need? I did a screener and I found out what the deficit area is. And is it progress monitored? So if we have all of these things, then that strategy goes beyond just tier 1, and now it's used as an intervention. So this comes directly from the Math Fact Fluency book on page 11. And here, Bay, Williams, and Kling talk about 10 questions to guide game selection. So when we're talking about the use of games as a research-based strategy to work on computation, we're not talking about randomly picking games. So the games in the book are researched, and we're thinking carefully about the game selection with these guidelines. So 1, to what extent does the game provide an opportunity to practice the subset of facts that the students are learning? So we're very specific about knowing the deficit area of the student and specifically choosing games that address the facts that the student needs to work on. To what extent does the game appeal to the age of your students so that it's respectful work? If I have high school kids, the games that I select may look different than if I have second graders. Employ visuals or tools such as 10 frames, quick looks, or arrays to support strategy development. Involves selecting from among derived fact strategies for mastery level games. And there's more on the research and the charts with derived fact strategies in the beginning of the book. Provide opportunities for discussion among students about their mathematical thinking. Encourage individual accountability, remove time pressures, involve logic and strategic moves, enhancing the fun factor, offer opportunities for adaptation so that all students can experience appropriate challenge, and lend itself to you being able to listen and watch in order to assess progress. So if we're using games as an intervention, it's not just having the kids play and the teacher does something else. The teacher is listening and taking quantitative and qualitative notes throughout to know exactly where the student is at. So you can learn more about this and get more ideas in Joe Bowler's article, Fluency Without Fear. So then the last piece of our flow chart in priority educational need is problem solving. So of course, limitations in word problem solving ability can reduce confidence for mathematics and affect learner performance on informal classroom evaluations, as well as on standardized state assessments. Students need to be competent problem solvers to meet the regimen of educational standards, and most importantly, to demonstrate proficiency in using mathematics to solve real-life problems. So one research-based strategy that we can use to address problem solving is called 3 reads. And this is an instructional routine that helps students to read like a mathematician. So instructional routines are specific and repeatable designs for learning that support both the teacher and students in the classroom, enabling all students to engage more fully in learning opportunities while building crucial mathematical thinking habits. So routines are an essential part of mathematics classrooms because they give structure to time and interactions, letting students know what to expect in terms of participation, supporting classroom management and organization, and promoting productive classroom relationships for teaching and learning. So they can help take a lot of the risk and fear out of mathematics. So a well-designed instructional routine opens up conversations and thinking about mathematics that might not happen by themselves. So you can learn more about instructional routines with this book, Routines for Reasoning, Fostering the Mathematical Practices in All Students. So back to the 3-read strategy, this is a specific instructional routine that we can use for problem solving.
So today we're going to continue with our 3-read protocol. Why do we do our 3-read protocol? Jalen?
The 3-read protocol helps them have a better understanding of what the math problem means. I'll read, they read, we read together.
JC and Emma are playing a game on their computer.
Initially, I read the problem without any numbers and there's no questions. When kids see numbers, they start to get very confused right away. So if we take out those numbers for a moment, they're reading it as a story.
The gist of the story was each round they get a certain amount of points.
And then they read, but this time they have the numbers.
JC has 74,000.
They're gonna pull out any important words, any numbers. Then we go back, we reread the problem a 3rd time with questions.
Who earned the most points altogether?
The 3-read protocol solidifies in their head what they're reading, and it helps to build their fluency.
So today.
Okay, so why should we use 3 reads? Well, students who are struggling typically are not able to make a visual of the word problem. So they need assistance with visualizing and identifying patterns. So that's what the 3-read strategy helps with. It helps them think of math in terms of a story and creating a picture of the story in their head. So it increases receptive language functions. So there's 2 pieces of language, expressive language and receptive language. And this strategy really helps with receptive language, which is our ability to interpret a question or make sense of a situation. So what is 3 reads? Well, it's literally 3 reads. So in the first read of the problem, we're eliciting student responses around what is the situation about. We're trying to visualize the actual story, and we may even leave out all of the numerical information in the problem. The second read is what are the quantities in this situation and how are they related? Or you may say, what is the mathy stuff? What are the numbers and what's happening with them? And then finally, in the third read, what are all the possible mathematical questions we could ask of this situation? Decide on one, then solve with a model or a diagram. So I like to phrase this to students as, which questions can we answer given the information in the problem?
So remember that when it comes to standardized testing, sometimes there's extra information in the problem. So you want your students to come up with some questions that maybe use some of the information in the problem and not all of it, while also coming up with questions that utilize all of the available information in the problem. Then, either as a whole group or even in small groups, you can let the students choose which of those problems they want to solve. This also increases engagement because there's some degree of choice. So, again, in the first read, you're reading the problem and you're really thinking about what is the situation about. This is when you're having that discussion with students about what's happening in the story, what's the action that is actually taking place here. So I want you to think to yourself, what are the biggest takeaways from using this strategy? We know that when you make it routine, students know that their mathematical ideas have merit. They take responsibility for developing and communicating their thinking. They expect that their ideas will be examined, built on, refined, and even challenged by their peers, and they take responsibility for collaborating and respectfully interrogating their classmates' mathematical thinking. 3 reads isn't the only research-based problem-solving strategy out there, though. You can find more with TINS, RIDE, FastDraw, and even Singapore Math. And this article linked at the bottom outlines some of them. So it's really important that if you're going to use one of these acronym strategies, that you're familiar with the research behind it. So for example, CUBES is not a research-based strategy. If you Google CUBES, you don't get a researcher's name, you find Pinterest and Teachers Pay Teachers. So we want to make sure that, especially when it comes to our most struggling students, that we're using these strategies that are clearly based in research. So we can, of course, progress monitor for number sense and computation. And remember that the goal is to progress monitor weekly. So if you're using an intervention program, oftentimes there are program embedded progress monitoring measures. Or if we're using a research or evidence-based strategy, you can use curriculum-based measures to progress monitor. You can learn more in the BEES portal Professional Development Alternatives, also known as PDAs. You can go to fl-pda.org to find some courses. There are facilitated courses such as Differentiating Math Instruction, which is worth 30 in-service points. And then there's also an independent study course called Math Difficulties, Disabilities, and Dyscalculia, and that's worth 8 in-service points in Broward County. And so I want to leave you with one concluding thought. Quality is never an accident. It is always the result of high intention, sincere effort, intelligent direction, and skillful execution, and it represents the wise choice of many alternatives. So we get to quality mathematics instruction not by accident, but by really collecting data, thinking about the priority educational need, and choosing the appropriate strategies and interventions, and then progress monitoring to get the best out of our students. Thank you.